the Chinese system is built close to perfection in terms of prioritizing state-led investment in strategic sectors and export-led driven growth, but at what cost, right? And the cost is household consumption, and that is the missing part right now that challenges Chinese policymakers today.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we usually talk a lot about over-disordering powers. You know how Russia, Iran, neo-populist leaders in democracies deliberately disorder the world. We've also spoken in our episodes about how kleptocracy has led to what we might think of as market economies not actually functioning like genuine markets. However, we haven't spent a lot of time investigating China's more ambivalent role in either ordering the world or disordering the world. I've become particularly interested in the issue of the Chinese mismanagement of its own economy. Massive levels of internal debt, the high savings rate, which led to a real estate bubble which recently burst, and the new bugbear of oversupply. If you're interested in the oversupply issue, I strongly recommend the Foreign Affairs article written by today's guest, Zoe Liu, which is in the show notes and entitled China's Real Economic Crisis, Why Beijing Won't Give Up on a Failing Model. But the point is, despite doing some good things, China is overall quite a bad actor on the world economic stage. It takes advantages of loopholes in currency markets and the WTO rules, and it abuses the global system to its perceived advantage, which actually ends up being worse for China in the long term, and far worse for everyone in that it is disordering. China's economy is so disordering to the global scene and has been in a way for more than a decade that it's become a major topic in U.S. domestic politics. Some people back in 2016 described the difference between Trump and Hillary as Trump was the one who was focused on China's evil actions and Hillary was the one focused on Russia's evil actions. That dynamic is playing out now, even as we race to the polls. With less than 2 weeks to go until the U.S. presidential election, news emerged that China had hacked J.D. Vance and Donald Trump's personal phones. And this is because they know that Vance and Trump are targeting China with these absurd economic tariffs that would destabilize all of the global economy. But Trump and Vance want to let Russia off the hook, while the Democrats are the opposite. They would increase sanctions on Russia and help Ukraine, but they don't have hardcore plans to contain China, or they have more nuanced plans that are not fully understood. So the Chinese economy really is a domestic U.S. political concern and is one of the top table issues in the upcoming election. So we thought this would be a great time to look deeper into how China is such a disorderer globally. To go on this journey and explain how the Chinese economy functions or doesn't, and what its disordering effects and non-market approach to capitalism with Chinese characteristics are, I am joined by Liu Zongyuan, who to her friends goes by Zoe, and she is the Maurice Greenberg Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and author of Sovereign Funds, How the Communist Party of China Finances Its Global Ambitions. And she's been a postdoc fellow at the Columbia Harvard China and the World program. Huanying Leidao Disorder, Zoe.
Thank you, Jason, for having me.
Zoe, you've lived a really interesting life and have had lots of experiences in the U.S. and Chinese university systems and in their foreign policy establishments. How have you seen U.S. academic and foreign policy understanding of China change over the last decade?
It's interesting that you start with how things have changed, because it indeed has changed. I consider myself one of the poster children of a good U.S.-China relationship. And so obviously not just from my vantage point, but also academics in China, in the United States, things have changed dramatically. We can think about a few turning points. The height of good U.S.-China economic and investment relationship could arguably say starting from 1978 up until, say, the running up to global financial crisis. And then since 2008 global financial crisis, you started to hear this phrase coming up again, the so-called the prevailing of the east wind over the west wind. But that was not just China's perspective in terms of how the collapse of U.S. financial system triggered a global system meltdown, right? And that also contributed to the rise of BRICS from a Goldman Sachs investment thesis to a loose partnership.
Thanks for mentioning BRICS. We had a really good episode on that. If I could sum up, when China was rising economically in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was the idea that a rising tide will lift all boats, and it would help the UK, US, and EU. But as China became more dominant and we had this financial crisis, there was more of a sense of a competition rather than a partnership. Is that right?
I think you are right in that there is more than an ounce of truth in terms of competition, especially in terms of ideas, values, and way of life, but less so in terms of economic relationship, because since China joined the WTO in December 2021, the rise of China, the rapid accumulation of foreign exchange reserve in China, and the globalization of Chinese companies and Chinese goods actually provided a lot of benefit, improved the welfare of consumers in countries like from America to Europe and to a lot of countries in Latin America, because made in China was good quality and also at a way much cheaper price.
Okay, so back to where we started off. How have the U.S. views on China changed? And now, how have Chinese understandings of America and the West's role in the world changed over this period?
I think starting from Obama period of time in the United States, policymakers started to complain more about China's not living up to America's expectation, the idea that as China joined the WTO, as the economy development, as market reform continues, it would not only lead to economic liberalization, but also political liberalization, following the same path of Japan and Korea. But that has not happened. And in China, this kind of West keeps how China should manage its own political economic affairs. That has been a complaint. But overall, I would say America's disappointment with why China has not changed. This is not the first time. The first time when American missionaries went to China, this kind of America can change China belief has led to perpetual disappointment.
How has Trump's entrance on the world stage since 2016 affected how academics and policymakers look at China? Not just Republican ones and not just American ones, but how is the China question viewed differently by Democrats and Europeans and Brits since Trump has come on the scene?
I think it really depends upon which Trump we are talking about. Trump visited China in 2017, and he called President Xi Jinping a great man, right? And it also led to the creation of China-U.S. Investment Cooperation Fund with the idea of promoting bilateral investment in both countries. But if we are thinking about Trump in 2018, that's a different version of Trump in the sense that he basically not just called out China as a currency manipulator, which is inaccurate, but also escalated the trade war inaccurately, saying that the Chinese are paying tariffs, but international trade or Econ 101 is the consumers paying the tariff.
I want to turn to something that Nicholas Burns, the U.S. ambassador to China, said when he was on the Foreign Policy Live podcast over the summer. And we're going to put a link to that in the show notes because he's a great communicator. He argued that U.S.-China diplomatic relations have actually really improved over the last 24 months since the whole spying balloon incident thing, and that we're now in a situation where there's a lot of, to use Nicholas Burns' word, connectivity between Chinese diplomats and American diplomats on things like law enforcement, shipment of fentanyl precursors to Mexico. Is this right, Zoe? Is there much more connectivity diplomatically and economically between the US and Europe and China than was ever the case between the West and the Soviet Union? So it really doesn't make sense to speak of a new Cold War.
Jason, I actually agree with Ambassador Nicholas Burns. And if we take a step back by looking at when the PRC, the People's Republic of China, was established back in 1949, the country was established under extreme international isolation. The only country that was China's friend was the Soviet Union. And since President Nixon visited China in 1972 and the two countries established a bilateral relationship in 1979, I would say Cold War ended in China much earlier than the collapse of the Soviet Union. So from that point of view, I would say over the years, it's not just U.S. businesses have went to China, helped lifting the Chinese economy over the years, but also even in times of extreme difficulties, diplomats and policymakers in the two countries try to put a guardrail to stabilize the relationship. So if we can name a few, just so that our listeners can understand what are the channels. For example, on economic side, yes, we hear a lot about export controls, investment screening, but between U.S. Treasury Department and the People's Bank of China, which is China's central bank, and Ministry of Finance of China, there are several working groups to cover issues related to anti-money laundering or stabilizing the Chinese economy and managing Chinese overcapacity challenge.
So one of the things we've tried to discuss on this pod, Zoe, is does more economic interconnection lead to peace, the kind of Norman Angel / McDonald's Golden Arches theory, meaning, as Stephanie Baker and I discussed, that two countries that have McDonald's have never been able to go to war together? I'm not sure, because I could see another opposing perspective, which is that the more Germany and England were interconnected economically before World War I, they were fighting for the same export markets. They were fighting for economic dominance. And if we look at the China-US situation now, we could see that there is a need to work together, but then there is also a competition for new markets and growth and whose economy is growing faster. How do you see about whether greater integration means we're going to have an inability for conflict, or greater integration means there's more to fight over?
And that's an interesting question, Jason. And I think it's actually a mix of both, in the sense that if we take a look at the hyperglobalization era, it was the McDonald's, it was the Japanese cars that increased not just the culture and mutual appreciation, or for that matter, just the food between, say, people in China who never had a cheese or had a burger with the Americans, or the British people who never had Chinese food, right? That was the era of globalization. But we are in a different era now, especially since the post-global financial crisis time. On the one hand, you had a less comfortable and more polarized societies in countries like America. And then on the other hand, you also had a increasingly insecure politicians thinking that they may losing their competitive edge because the rise of a political economic system such as China that don't necessarily share the American or Western views.
So there's been a lot going on with the Chinese economy over the last year. About 8 months ago, there were some forces caught up in a massive corruption scandal that led to the ousting of multiple senior Chinese leaders. Could you tell us more about that purge and reports of graft affecting the Chinese military? Because we've seen that in Russia, there's a lot of corruption in the defense procurement sector. How could this affect the strength of the PLA? And what's your assessment on how that corruption issue is connected throughout other parts of the Chinese economy?
I think corruption, broadly speaking, in emerging market economies where there are a lot of red tapes, sometimes corruption works as the lubricant, they facilitate things. But in this one particular case, right, I think since President Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, he has been waging this so-called anti-corruption campaign for a long period of time. And many people have argued that, yes, he is doing this in a genuine way, but there have also been arguments saying that he's using this to push out his political rivals. And in the particular case of expel the PLA generals, I think it speaks on two things. The first one is lessons that he learned from President Putin's invasion of Ukraine and how the Russian military dysfunctioned. And then the second part is he needed a functioning Chinese military in order to achieve the goal of the modernization of PLA and make them combat ready.
That's very interesting. So we've been skirting around lots of different issues about the Chinese economy. Let's get into your specialty and something that I find very interesting, overcapacity. So the Chinese CCP leadership, as I understand it, has over years pressured local officials, maybe for decades, to invest in industrial capacity and then to produce specific goods. Like they motivated Chinese banks to make loans to build factories for goods that the market did not yet demand. And this is the way in which capitalism with Chinese characteristics has some central planning aspects. And then over the last years, this has gotten worse. So some Chinese firms have gone bust. And if we go back to what is overcapacity, this is that more solar panels are being produced or more EVs are being produced in China than the market needs. And then these goods have to be dumped or they have to be sold below the amount that it costs to produce them because they're produced for non-market reasons. That's how I understand overcapacity and oversupply. Could you define or explain the phenomenon maybe better than I can?
If I put my economist hat on, I would say from a pure supply-demand point of view, overcapacity is almost equivalent to overproduction in the sense that there is more goods and stuff being produced than market demand. But if we take a step back by taking a look at the whole political factor behind it, things are complex because we are living in a year of global market and countries trade with each other. If you are familiar with, the classic economists like Adam Smith or David Ricardo, they would talk about, the benefit of international trade and specialization, the idea that if my country is good at producing shoes, then I should produce shoes for the rest of the world. Whereas, countries that are good at producing solar panels, they should be specializing in producing solar panels. But this is a complicated issue, and this speaks to the nature of why Chinese government have been persistently denying that China has overcapacity problem. Because from their point of view, China is producing for the global market, whereas you also have India, you have Ethiopia, you have UAE or Saudi Arabia. They also wanting to have their own industries where if cheap Chinese goods flood in, it makes it very difficult for other countries to even jumpstart their industries. And many people are worried that with the rise of Chinese solar panel and in particular China's dominance in the supply chain of renewable energy, China is going to have a dominance, and that becomes a little bit worrisome, especially from national security purposes.
That was a great explanation of what is overcapacity. I want to look at how this is connected to the Chinese economy growing less and doing worse than it did 5, 10, or more years ago. Is it true that over the last year, lots of Chinese firms have gone bust or have turned into the so-called zombie companies where, because they have lots of debt, they have to keep producing to pay off the debt, but they can never really make money?
I think the zombie firms in the Chinese economy is not new, and it has existed since the beginning of the reform and opening up era. But I would argue that the nuanced aspect of this time is that the highly, highly competitive domestic market lead to a very thin profit margin at a company level. So when companies realize that they can sell at a higher price overseas. They would look for opportunities overseas. This contributes to the factor of the rush out of Chinese companies, not just, seeking out market in the United States or European Union, but also markets in India or the Gulf Cooperation Council member countries or in Latin America.
Super interesting. And I want to inject a historical parallel here. Maybe some listeners will know about Hobson, the theorist of imperialism. He wrote that empire in general is driven by overproduction. He meant that because the British had industrialized first in the mid-19th century, they were seeking new markets. The domestic British market already had all the textiles and all the widgets that it needed, but there was always going to be a new place in Africa or India or the Middle East where they didn't have these manufactured textiles or widgets. So you needed to either conquer them or have a protectorate over them and export your goods there. And that there was also the need to get higher returns because investors couldn't get great returns in Britain or the US because those were advanced economies. There were always going to be more returns in an imperial context. And of course, this is not exactly the same as what Zoe has just described about China, but just that when you have a really competitive domestic market and you have a very low margin for profits, and then you can't get as high returns by investing in China as you can by investing abroad, it creates interesting political requirements for the political economy. And thinking about China's need to export and to invest and send capital from its surplus abroad, do you think that since Deng Xiaoping, China has really become a capitalist country? Or is there a command economy with some capitalist elements, but the need to correct some of these imbalances leads to a lot of state intervention that could be disordering on the global economy?
Jason, that's a really interesting way to frame it. And in fact, I would argue that China started investing overseas, not because it had surplus capital, but because it wanted to achieve better technologies and achieve expertise from overseas market. And that was when China started making overseas investment back in 1978. At that time, China did not have excess capital or extreme amount of foreign exchange reserves. But over the years, I would say at least when Deng Xiaoping started reform and open up, he did establish a system that an export-driven and state-led growth model. And over the past 40 years, basically the Chinese policymakers perfected this system that prioritizes state-led investment and export.
You sketched out some very interesting and unique components of the Chinese economic system, which has been perfected to certain short-term advantages, but has certain medium and long-term structural instabilities. You can't just make growth by having a tremendous amount of export earnings and a surplus, and then a very high domestic savings rate. This is not something that can be sustained forever. What are some of the instabilities and non-sustainable aspects of this system?
Number one example that comes to my mind is China's housing bubble. And a very important contributing factor leading to China's housing bubble is the lack of alternative investment opportunities in the context of very high savings rate. And a lot of this has a lot to do with the so-called capital control, meaning Chinese people cannot take their money and just invest in the United States or in the European Union. So in this particular context, in order to achieve higher return on capital, meaning Chinese families, they wanted to make more money of their savings. So they ended up buying houses and speculate on the housing market. So this literally contributed to the rapid rise of housing prices across first-tier cities in China.
After the break, we're going to talk about oversupply, overcapacity, and Chinese oversavings. Let's return to this issue of oversupply, because we've sketched a few things out. Why do Chinese factories now produce twice as many solar panels as the world can consume, and the Chinese output of steel, coal, aluminum, glass, cement, EV batteries, and some other commodities dwarf the output of all the other countries put together. How did this come about?
The way that I think about it is from two sides, on the investment and consumption. On the investment side, you still see local government across China implement industrial policies set by the central government in Beijing to continue investment in the so-called strategic sectors, from solar panels to semiconductors, or for that matter, EVs and batteries. You keep investing to build more factories so that you can continue build out and produce more. And then on the other side, domestic consumption simply has declined. As a result, you produce more than you can consume domestically, at least in the near term.
And in a way, it sounds to me like China has become the victim of its own success. I'm going to make an analogy with Israel in a very different context about how succeeding too much or becoming too good at something can actually end up hurting you. So if we look at Israel in 1967, they won this unbelievable victory. They conquered the West Bank and the Sinai and the Golan. They wiped out 5 Arab countries' air forces. But then they didn't know how to govern them, and they achieved more and more military dominance over the whole region. And now the blowback of all this dominance is that they have the military and tactical ability to kill Hezbollah commanders and to get them with exploding pagers. But to what end? Where does it go? And if I explain this analogy with China, China has been about the most successful country in human history in going from a low economic basis to becoming good at more advanced forms of manufacturing, creating a complete supply chain, creating more and more complex things to manufacture. Like, it's not easy to make a solar panel or semiconductors. And looked at in 1950, China was a low-income, low-technology place. And now it's a high-income, high-technology place. There's been just so much constant success and advancement, but without a vision, to my mind, unless I'm missing something here, of like, where does this all go with China's place in the global economy? You can't just constantly succeed in out-competing people at making cheaper and better steel or EVs or solar panels, because it won't work. It's like achieving more and more military dominance. Where does that go if there's not a longer-term political strategy?
I think, Jason, I like the analogy that you are making. The Chinese system is built close to perfection in terms of prioritizing state-led investment in strategic sectors and export-led driven growth. But at what cost, right? And the cost is household consumption, and that is the missing part right now that challenges Chinese policymakers today to how can they mobilize Chinese household to spend more when their income growth has stagnated, and that is a very challenging job. They have been very good at setting production target, achieving the goal or marching towards the goal of a manufacturing superpower. But the Chinese household, or for that matter, Chinese graduate student, started to realize that, they don't necessarily want to be a factory worker.
You know what you reminded me of there, Zoe? After the 9/11, I was in New York, and W. Bush gave a speech, and he said, if you're a patriotic American and you're worried about the 9/11, go shopping. Go to the shopping mall, spend. We're seeing too much savings and too much worry, and the Dow Jones Industrials are down. Americans spend. And I remember thinking, that's so dumb. Do you know what I mean? Like, this has got to be wrong. But I'm not an economist, and maybe there is something to it, which is that when people have a shock, whether it's an economic downturn or political downturn, or they're afraid about a war, the natural response is to save and to become worried. There's this thing called consumer sentiment. And consumer sentiment gets worse. And then when people feel comfortable and the world is at peace, they spend more on restaurant meals and they take more vacations. So is there something to it, which is that W. Bush was right after the 9/11. Americans just needed to go on their vacations and do air travel. And now the Chinese leadership, when they're facing some of these economic downturns, they just need to get middle-class families in China to want to spend more.
I think there is more than an ounce of truth there in the sense that if we take a look at how economy can grow, you have investment, which need capital. You also have export, which China is very good at, but China is missing household consumption, meaning Chinese families simply, they want to save more and they tend to spend less. And there are more structural reasons behind that. It's not just that Chinese people don't like to go on shoppings for good stuff or go on vacations. They do. And if you think about a couple, at least before COVID, Louis Vuittons or Hermes, they were so successful in China because Chinese people were spending, right? And the Chinese tourists, they go to Milan, they go to London, the Chinese people were going places. But since COVID, not just because of, international flight hasn't, fully recovered, but also because two things. One, their confidence about their income can continue to grow has declined. And B, our second is that the lack of social security welfare and the burden that the Chinese household has to take care of older people, their parents or even their grandparents. And then they also have to spend for their children's education, the after-school schools. It used to be the case that kids go to study painting or play basketball, but now Chinese kids, middle class, in order to show that you made it, you have to send your kids to go to expensive horse riding or dressage classes. That's a lot of expending on the burden. So from that point of view, how could a Chinese family be willing to spend on expensive appliances when they already have some?
Now let's talk about debt. Obviously, we talked about household savings, but although households are saving, there is a lot of a debt crisis. The Wall Street Journal wrote in July that China might have as much as 10 trillion US dollars in off-the-books debt, with nearly $1 trillion going into default in 2024. What does that mean? How bad might Chinese debt be? And could that be a disordering implication for the global economy?
Very short answer to the last part of the question. Can Chinese debt negatively impact the global economy or trigger another financial crisis? My answer is no. And the reason is because the majority of the Chinese debt are held domestically. And then the first part of the question, I think the essence is that how much should we worry about the building up of Chinese debt, right? Debt on its own is not bad because if you think about an entrepreneur, in order to build your business, it's natural to take out the loans in order to build your business as long as your business is growing faster than the growth of your debt.
And I want to point out that the role of credit and credit expansion in economic growth is so obvious. Like part of the reason that in the Islamic world, particularly the Islamic world that is not hydrocarbon producing, there isn't a growth economically, is they don't do credit. Islamic banking makes credit and debt very difficult. And if you don't go into debt, you can't mortgage the house to create a business, and then you can't buy the things that you need in your supply chain and have inventory. Debt is incredibly important, and I'm just wondering if there might be a lot of public debt that could be coming down the pipeline and leading to some kind of burst.
On the public side, I would say if we look at Beijing, like the central government balance sheet, or to what extent the central government or Ministry of Finance has a lot of debt. The off-balance sheet or the so-called hidden debt was very largely a product of the previous 4 trillion stimulus package when China was trying to deal with global financial crisis. So this is why the nature of the debt is not necessarily no. That is one of the major challenge. They are simply hidden under the table.
Great. So if we're talking about this hidden debt, play a little mind game with me. If the economic shit really hit the fan in China, could that lead to various political pressures? Like, you know what? If people's real incomes are going down, maybe Xi would want to distract the population by speaking against Taiwan or speaking about the need to reunite with Taiwan. Because when we look at, people who want to have aggressive wars, usually it's because there's an economic crisis at home or the need to distract the population. We can think about Russia and Crimea and Russia and the Ukraine war. Generally, it's a desire to distract from crises at home. Are you worried about this?
Personally, I still think that the basis for the Communist Party of China to govern is continued economic performance. But for the party itself, its aspiration, reunite Taiwan with mainland has always been part of the party's identity, if you will. So from that point of view, if the assumption is that any leader, whether it is authoritarian or not, if any leader wanted to stay in power, you would have to have an economy that at least is not crushing. So this is why I think perhaps the recent bad economic numbers made President Xi Jinping realize that, well, the economy is not necessarily doing good. Let's do something about it, rather than rushing into a militarized conflict. Because if you think about it, the very fast way for a leader to go or to be challenged is that you start a war that you cannot win.
I can see this in multiple different ways. Putin has started a war that he can't win. And it's been 2.5, going on 3, going on, however many years. He's not going to get ousted, because there is a way in which, if we go back to that great episode with Marcel Dursis, episode 67, we look at authoritarian systems as having certain stakeholders, the people near the leader, and they may not really be affected by people suffering, but the leader just needs to keep the people around him happy to stay in power. I would agree with you that the Chinese system has more inputs from the people than the Russian system, and that if there is large discontent because the economy is not growing, that affects the Chinese leadership more than in Russia. The Russian economy can crater, and there aren't as many feedbacks into the elite, but I'm not sure that the desire to distract would not be there. This is something that non-democracies throughout all of human history have experienced, and maybe democracies as well. So I don't think that we should ignore the potential for disordering implications of a Chinese economic collapse. No?
The damage of potential collapse of the Chinese economy is not going to be, disastrous for China, but also for the rest of the world. Because if you think about it, companies that rely on their Chinese suppliers is not necessarily going to work. And it is almost 18 trillion economy. The collapse of the Chinese economy is going to be disastrous for the rest of the world, right? But I think what you are leading to is, to what extent President Xi Jinping, because he's facing economic challenge and because it is not easy to solve China's economic dilemma, he may resort to a war with Taiwan. Now, the reason why I understand why a lot of analysts would make that argument, but I think there are two issues there. The first one is logistics, right? And if you think about the logistics of war against Taiwan, first of all, we have to define when did the war start? Like, what did the start of the war looks like? And then secondly, if we look at the composition of the PLA, more than 80% of the PLA combat forces, they are the so-called one-child generation. And this is important from an economic point of view because China has suffered 2 consecutive years of negative population growth. And Chinese leader, President Xi Jinping, has also asked Chinese household to have not just 1 child, but 3 children. You imagine in a war scenario when the nation mobilized to go to war, it basically means that you are going to perhaps suffer a tremendous of population loss, not just as what, in recent time, like Russia's war against Ukraine or for that matter, World War II.
Speaking of how the Chinese leadership thinks, I want to ask you, what can the West do that might influence them to collaborate more, to be less disordering, and to, want to help in mediating in Ukraine, to want to help in mediating in Israel-Palestine or the Israel-Lebanese war? I've been really surprised throughout the course of my career that as China has become the number 2 global player economically and militarily and politically, they don't really have an active foreign policy towards the 5 major conflicts going on in the world today. And by that, I mean Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, the Syrian civil war, the Yemeni internal war, and the Venezuelan crisis. It would be very difficult to pinpoint what is Chinese policy to trying to help resolve these issues. So What can we do, we in the West, to try to get the Chinese to want to work with us, coordinate with us on solving these most pressing disordering issues?
First of all, I think it's interesting that the way you frame it, because it reminded me of since the end of COVID, a group of Chinese scholars came over to visit, and they asked me a question. Why the United States and members of the European Union thinks that China has a role to play in the war in Ukraine. I think that question is very revealing, and it shows that at least from their point of view, China doesn't have any position to begin with, and that is consistent with Chinese foreign policy's principle, one of which is the non-interference, right? And then secondly, I think it's also revealing in the sense that a lot of these wars from China's point of view is far away, and probably they did not necessarily think China needs to be involved in so many different ways. But fundamentally, I do think that there perhaps the perception gap between China and the West is way too big in terms of how they view the role of Russia, how they view the Venezuelan war, how they view the conflict in Israel, between Israel and Gaza. The perceptions and who is to be blamed more, there are just simply the gap is too big. I don't necessarily think there are too much that the West can do to incentivize China to change, especially in the context of rising tensions economically and geopolitically between the West and China.
How can we order the disorder here? What should Chinese leaders do to try to order the disorderly picture of the Chinese economy right now?
I think that's a hard question, and I don't want to be in their position because in order to rebalance the Chinese economy, I am afraid that it would need a systematic change. On the one hand, the government would have to be able to tolerate a slower economic growth, and which is they are showing that they are willing to do, but not to stimulate the supply side. They need to provide support to the Chinese household, incentivize Chinese household to feel safe to spend and feel confident about their own individual economic security. But that is going to be extremely hard to achieve, especially now, because when you have a leader trying to make China a manufacturing superpower and a military and financial superpower, you ended up, and at a time when the West is implementing investment screening and export controls, cutting China from the most cutting edge chips and technology, you raise the cost of China's technological innovation. So this basically means any money given to Chinese household is going to be a diversion from helping the nation to become a superpower. So from that point of view, I think it really needs a strategic shift in mindset, being able to accept that it is okay to not be a superpower.
Wow. I think that you provided lots of answers there, but I want to spin it slightly differently. What if it's accepting that China already is a superpower? I see China as the second superpower in the world, and that we're in a world where Russia might not be a true superpower, but China and America are superpowers. And therefore, this need to constantly get better and better and to be more leading in manufacturing or more leading in some military or high-end tech sector is not needed. China is already a superpower.
I think there is more than an ounce of truth there, but I tend to think superpower from the point of view of vulnerabilities. Superpowers are not always secure. And if you think about the fastest runner in the world, sometimes they tend to look back and see how much distance they have. And as soon as you are looking back, you are not only slowing yourself down, but also you are distracted. And I think that's the superpower conundrum that the United States is suffering from now. It's not because the United States is declining, it's because of this self-doubt. And from China's point of view, I think China also suffers from this catching up challenge in the sense that you see the strength of the nation. You see China as a homogenous power without realizing that actually China is very rich cities that have more in common with New York or London, like Shanghai or Shenzhen. But you also have rural area that would have a lot in common with countries or cities in Latin America.
Super interesting. So continuing to order the disorder, does the political will in the West exist to face down China over some of these practices of oversupply that could destabilize the world economy and makes it impossible for Danish or American solar panels to really compete? And if we don't have this political will, should we, and how might it exist?
Well, I think it really depends upon the political priorities, right? If the priority is to make for the world to move towards a greener and more sustainable future, to get rid of the hydrocarbon faster and cheaper, then perhaps if we only look at the issues through this lens, then it is easy to make the argument saying that why not have the Chinese supply the rest of the world, right? But things are not that simple. So if the West continues with the idea that we want to have our own industrial policies so that we can outcompete the Chinese, you end up with a world of oversupply. And that is not necessarily going to be good for better use of resources.
So zooming out on the relationship between China and the West, is it a little bit like a marriage that has gone slightly wrong? One partner abuses the other, one has a financial and psychological hold on the other, but then the other is dependent on this one to help it cook its meals, and it's attracted to this, and I need you to help me pack. How would you see this in terms of a marriage where neither side can escape, but neither is really fulfilled?
China and America are perhaps in a relationship similar to marriage, but unlike a marriage where, the couples can go to see a marriage counselor, the two countries now are in a state where sometimes they simply don't want to talk to each other. And this is what I see the risk of not communicating leads to the worst assumptions of each other, but the worst assumption of each other leads to misdecisions. So from that point of view, I do hope that there would be, hopefully more communication channels would not only stabilize the relationship, but also lead to better policy decisions on both sides.
Last attempt to order the disorder, Zoe. We love on the disorder program asking people, if you could create one institution on the global stage that would help us order our mid-21st century world, and in your case, help calm the potential threat of the deterioration of the U.S.-China relationship, what would that institution be and how would it function?
Maybe a good first step is to have people listen to Disorder.
They say flattery will get you everywhere in this world, and sometimes they're right.
I think we already have a lot of institutions, and sometimes overlapping institutions may not necessarily be a good thing. I guess instead of creating something new, I hope this is perhaps more of a call for the Americans to restore the WTO system. Not saying that the WTO is perfect, but at least there are rooms to change such that, for example, instead of designating one entire economy as non-market, perhaps we can look at things sector by sector. And I think by restoring existing institutions which have vested interest, you can bring countries back to the negotiation table.
It's critical to work with what we have because one of the themes that we've explained when it comes to our world, you can't just throw the UN system out because no one will agree on what to replace it. So the UN is broken in some ways. You got to try to make it work better. If I could kind of sum up Zoe's answer here, it's that we have mechanisms, not only the WTO, but other economic fora. And it would be really difficult to create new ones that might overlap. We have to try to make the channels that we have and the economic agreements that we have function better. So on that positive note, thank you for ordering the disorder with me, Zoe.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please tap follow wherever you get your podcasts. Also, check out the link in the show notes to subscribe to the Substack where we have lots of exciting content. For this episode in particular, because there's so many terms and so much economic background, I hope you check out other links in the show notes about the Chinese real estate bubble, more about Zoe's work, her amazing article in Foreign Affairs about oversupply, and other things about the Chinese central bank and stuff like that. As always, our producer has been George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. We hope you have an orderly week free from oversupply and even free of over savings. So why not go to the pub, spend a little bit, and cure the over savings problem?